Chapter 6. The inventory of the castaways can be promptly taken. Thrown upon a desert coast, they had nothing but the clothes they wore in the balloon. We must add Spilett's watch and notebook, which he had kept by some inadvertence, but there were no firearms and no tools, not even a pocket knife. Everything had been thrown overboard to lighten the balloon. Every necessary of life was wanting. Yet if Cyrus Smith had been with them, his practical science and inventive genius would have saved them from despair. But, alas! They could hope to see him no more. The castaways could rely on Providence only, and on their own right hands. And, first, should they settle down on this strip of coast without an effort to discover whether it was island or continent, inhabited or desert? It was an urgent question, for all their measures would depend upon its solution. However, it seemed to Pencroff better to wait a few days before undertaking an exploration. They must try to procure more satisfying food than eggs and shellfish, and repair their strength, exhausted by fatigue and by the inclemency of the weather. The Chimneys would serve as a house for a while. Their fire was lit, and it would be easy to keep alive some embers. For the time being there were plenty of eggs and shellfish. They might even be able to kill, with a stick or a stone, some of the numerous pigeons which fluttered among the rocks. They might find fruit trees in the neighboring forest, and they had plenty of fresh water. It was decided then to wait a few days at the Chimneys, and to prepare for an expedition either along the coast or into the interior of the country. This plan was especially agreeable to Neb, who was in no hurry to abandon that part of the coast which had been the scene of the catastrophe. He could not and would not believe that Smith was dead. Until the waves should have thrown up the engineer's body, until Neb should have seen with his eyes and handled with his hands his master's corpse, he believed him alive. It was an illusion which the sailor had not the heart to destroy, and there was no use in talking to Nebraska. He was like the dog who would not leave his master's tomb, and his grief was such that he would probably soon follow him. Upon the morning of the 26th of March, at daybreak, Neb started along the coast northward to the spot where the sea had doubtless closed over the unfortunate engineer. For breakfast that morning they had only eggs and lithodomes, seasoned with salt which Herbert had found in the cavities of the rocks. When the meal was over they divided forces. The reporter stayed behind to keep up the fire, and in the very improbable case of Neb's needing him to go to his assistance, Herbert and Pencroff went into the forest. "We will go hunting, Herbert," said the sailor. "We shall find ammunition on our way, and we will cut our guns in the forest." But, before starting, Herbert suggested that as they had no tinder they must replace it by burnt linen. They were sorry to sacrifice a piece of handkerchief, but the need was urgent, and a piece of Pencroff's large check handkerchief was soon converted into a charred rag, and put away in the central chamber in a little cavity of the rock, sheltered from wind and dampness. By this time it was 9 o'clock. The weather was threatening and the breeze blew from the southeast. Herbert and Pencroff, as they left the Chimneys, cast a glance at the smoke which curled upwards from amid the rocks, then they walked up the left bank of the river. When they reached the forest, Pencroff broke from the first tree 2 thick branches which he made into cudgels, and whose points Herbert blunted against a rock. What would he not have given for a knife? Then the hunters walked on in the high grass along the bank of the river, which, after its turn to the southwest, gradually narrowed, running between high banks and overarched by interlacing trees. Pencroff, not to lose his way, determined to follow the course of the stream, which would bring him back to his point of departure. But the bank offered many obstacles. Here, trees whose flexible branches bent over to the brink of the current; there, thorns and lianas which they had to break with their sticks. Herbert often glided between the broken stumps with the agility of a young cat and disappeared in the copse, but Pencroff called him back at once, begging him not to wander away. Meanwhile, the sailor carefully observed the character and peculiarities of the region. On this left bank the surface was flat, rising insensibly towards the interior. Sometimes it was moist and swampy, indicating the existence of a subterranean network of little streams emptying themselves into the river. Sometimes, too, a brook ran across the copse, which they crossed without trouble. The opposite bank was more undulating, and the valley, through whose bottom flowed the river, was more clearly defined. The hill, covered with trees rising in terraces, intercepted the vision. Along this right bank they could hardly have walked, for the descent was steep, and the trees which bent over the water were only sustained by their roots. It is needless to say that both forest and shore seemed a virgin wilderness. They saw fresh traces of animals whose species was unknown to them. Some seemed to them the tracks of dangerous wild beasts, but nowhere was there the mark of an axe on a tree trunk, or the ashes of a fire, or the imprint of a foot. They should no doubt have been glad that it was so, for on this land in the mid-Pacific, the presence of man was a thing more to be dreaded than desired. They hardly spoke, so great were the difficulties of the route. After an hour's walk they had but just compassed a mile. Hitherto their hunting had been fruitless. Birds were singing and flying to and fro under the trees, but they showed an instinctive fear of their enemy man. Herbert descried among them, in a swampy part of the forest, a bird with narrow and elongated beak, in shape something like a kingfisher, from which it was distinguished by its harsh and lustrous plumage. "That must be a jacamar," said Herbert, trying to get within range of the bird. "It would be a good chance to taste jacamar," answered the sailor, "if that fellow would only let himself be roasted." In a moment a stone, adroitly aimed by the boy, struck the bird on the wing, but the jacamar took to his legs and disappeared in a minute. "What a muff I am," said Herbert. "Not at all," said the sailor. "It was a good shot, a great many would have missed the bird. Don't be discouraged, we'll catch him again some day." The wood opened as the hunters went on, and the trees grew to a vast height, but none had edible fruits. Pencroff sought in vain for some of those precious palm trees, which lend themselves so wonderfully to the needs of mankind, and which grow from 40 degrees north latitude to 35 degrees south. But this forest was composed only of conifers, such as the deodars, already recognized by Herbert, the Douglas pines, which grow on the northeast coast of America, and magnificent fir trees, 150 feet high. Among their branches was fluttering a flock of birds, with small bodies and long, glittering tails. Herbert picked up some of the feathers, which lay scattered on the ground, and looked at them carefully. "These are carucas," said he. "I would rather have a guinea hen, or a heathcock," said Pencroff, "but still, if they are good to eat." "They are good to eat," said Herbert, "their meat is delicious. Besides, I think we can easily get at them with our sticks." Slipping through the grass, they reached the foot of a tree whose lower branches were covered with the little birds, who were snapping at the flying insects. Their feathered claws clutched tight the twigs on which they were sitting. Then the hunters rose to their feet, and using their sticks like a scythe, they mowed down whole rows of the carucas, of whom 105 were knocked over before the stupid birds thought of escape. "Good," said Pencroff, "this is just the sort of game for hunters like us. We could catch them in our hands." They skewered the carucas on a switch like field larks, and continued to explore. The object of the expedition was, of course, to bring back as much game as possible to the Chimneys. So far it had not been altogether attained. They looked about everywhere, and were enraged to see animals escaping through the high grass. If they had only had Top. But Top, most likely, had perished with his master. About 3 o'clock they entered a wood full of juniper trees, at whose aromatic berries flocks of birds were pecking. Suddenly they heard a sound like the blast of a trumpet. It was the note of those gallinaceae, called tetras in the United States. Soon they saw several pairs of them, with brownish-yellow plumage and brown tails. Pencroff determined to capture one of these birds, for they were as big as hens, and their meat as delicious as a pullet. But they would not let him come near them. At last, after several unsuccessful attempts, he said, "Well, since we can't kill them on the wing, we must take them with a line." "Like a carp," cried the wondering Herbert. Like a carp, answered the sailor, gravely. Pencroff had found in the grass half a dozen tetras nests, with 2 or 3 eggs in each. He was very careful not to touch these nests, whose owners would certainly return to them. Around these he purposed to draw his lines, not as a snare, but with hook and bait. He took Herbert to some distance from the nests, and there made ready his singular apparatus with the care of a true disciple of Isaac Walton. Herbert watched the work with a natural interest, but without much faith in its success. The lines were made of small lianas tied together, from 15 to 20 feet long, and stout thorns with bent points, broken from a thicket of dwarf acacias, and fastened to the ends of the lianas, served as hooks, and the great red worms which crawled at their feet made excellent bait. This done, Pencroff, walking stealthily through the grass, placed one end of his hook and line close to the nests of the tetras. Then he stole back, took the other end in his hand, and hid himself with Herbert behind a large tree. Herbert, it must be said, was not sanguine of success. A good half-hour passed, but as the sailor had foreseen, several pairs of tetras returned to their nests. They hopped about, pecking the ground, and little suspecting the presence of the hunters, who had taken care to station themselves to leeward of the gallinaceae. Herbert held his breath with excitement, while Pencroff, with dilated eyes, open-mouthed, and lips parted as if to taste a morsel of tetras, scarcely breathed. Meanwhile the gallinaceae walked heedlessly among the hooks. Pencroff then gave little jerks, which moved the bait up and down as if the worms were still alive. How much more intense was his excitement than the fisherman's who cannot see the approach of his prey. The jerks soon aroused the attention of the gallinaceae, who began to peck at the bait. 3 of the greediest swallowed hook and bait together. Suddenly, with a quick jerk, Pencroff pulled in his line, and the flapping of wings showed that the birds were taken. "Hurrah!" cried he, springing upon the game, of which he was master in a moment. Herbert clapped his hands. It was the first time he had seen birds taken with a line, but the modest sailor said it was not his first attempt, and, moreover, that the merit of the invention was not his. "And at any rate," said he, "in our present situation we must hope for many such contrivances." The tetras were tied together by the feet, and Pencroff, happy that they were not returning empty-handed, and perceiving that the day was ending, thought it best to return home. Their route was indicated by the river, and following it downward, by 6 o'clock, tired out by their excursion, Herbert and Pencroff re-entered the Chimneys.